Firstly, thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see a great turnout, and that's becoming quite standard for our 48 Group Club Young Icebreaker events. I am Edward Holroyd-Pierce, co-chair of Young Icebreakers, and it's a pleasure to be here just to briefly introduce the Young Icebreakers. We put together 5 or 6 events each year, similar to tonight's event, with a few in other formats as well. They occur both in London and outside London, and this gives me an opportunity to mention a particularly successful event last week in Beijing, where Professor Peter Nolan of Cambridge University attracted an audience of 275 people in the Beijing hotel. And this is also a good opportunity to thank my co-chair, Adam Lacey, who did a huge amount of work putting that event together, and has also done a lot for tonight's event. There are some other members of the committee of the Young Icebreakers here tonight as well, so I would encourage you to talk to us. If you're interested in more than just being a part of the audience, do also let us know. It's very easy to find us. And also check out the website. If you just Google 48 Group Club, you will find all the information about the history of the club, the events, and so on. So please don't be a stranger. Before the stage gets handed over to Gerard and Jim, I'd like to just say a big thank you to Linklaters for hosting tonight's event, and give Nicola Mayo a chance to tell us a little bit about Linklaters in China and Nicola's own China story. So thank you again for sponsoring.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you indeed for coming to tonight's event. And as we said, on behalf of Linklaters, I'm actually very delighted to be able to welcome you to this evening, and as you'll see, my first inaugural event for the 48 Club. Like the 48 Group Club at Linklaters, we're very keenly interested in China's development, its emergence on the world stage, and the opportunities that it creates for many clients, both within China and also clients outside of China. And I've had the privilege of seeing this firsthand. I've actually very recently, in the last couple of weeks, just returned from a 4-year stint out in our Shanghai office, where it was, I have to say, a real privilege just to witness China's development, the speed and the scale at which China is developing and continuing to develop and emerge further on the global stage, and the interest that this, of course, continues to attract from all overseas investors. I saw sort of the introduction on penetration of more and more foreign brands in China across all sectors: retail, automotive, insurance, the list goes on. The ever-increasing number of familiar foreign names on the side of buildings, on billboards, as I'd make my way around Shanghai, on the way from home to the airport, a huge number, always increasing, of international names, huge operating facilities with international names on the outside of it. On the way to actually some very very modern airport facilities at Pudong and Puxi, just a further reflection really of China's commitment of development of its own domestic economy and infrastructure. And alongside this, though, it was a great unique time to really see the emergence of Chinese investors and Chinese companies on the world stage, and actually see them successfully operating in developed markets, investing and acquiring internationally recognized brands as the Go Global policy starts to bear fruit. I mean, during my time in China, our firm's client base changed immensely from a few select Chinese corporates, expanding to cover many, many Chinese corporates, some household names in China, some much sort of and heard of outside of China, many probably never heard of outside of China. From Bright Foods, often mentioned acquisition of Weetabix, to Honey Capital's recent acquisition of Pizza Express, to CCB's recently completed acquisition of a controlling stake of a bank in Brazil. I mean, the list goes on. It's certainly an honour then, as I say, for me to be here for my first 48 Club event, but also an honour for Linklaters to continue in supporting the 48 Group Club and its efforts to build relationships between China and the UK. And with such an established reputation as a leading economist, I'm sure that Jim O'Neill needs no introduction. On top of his career at Goldman Sachs, from which he retired as chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, he is famous for creating the BRIC acronym, and most recently MINT. And we are very fortunate enough to have him here with us this evening to chair the lecture by Gerard Lyons. Jim, thank you very much and welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Nicola. It's obviously a great pleasure for me also to be here. Actually, again, I remember sitting up here at a previous event this great firm has hosted, I think, for the 48 Group. And I was performing a similar role on that occasion, if I remember rightly, or not for this gentleman. But anyhow, it is great to be here. My duty tonight is to chair the proceedings and to briefly introduce Gerard. So with no further ado, let me do that. The plan is Gerard is going to talk for some length, 25 minutes it says for me, and then I will perhaps make a couple of observations and then leave it to all of you to ask questions, and we will, under my chairing, finish promptly as suggested in the timetable at 7:25, 7:30 I think it is. So let me just say a couple of things about Gerard. We've actually known each other, I guess, since the early to mid-80s, right? We worked together briefly in the almighty Swiss Bank Corporation's early days of trying to conquer the universe, which is a story for another
late 80s.
Another occasion.
So, yeah.
But Gerard has gone on from those days, in my judgment, to be one of the pioneers of trying to understand our very complex and changing world. And of course, with the rise of China and other so-called emerging powers at the core of it. And so it is a great pleasure for me to have this responsibility tonight. He has recently published a book, which I'm sure you can all buy and have it signed outside. It's got really good endorsements by various people, myself included. And the final thing I would say, he spent far too many years working for a bank that was sponsored by Liverpool Football Club. I would have not have performed that duty tonight if that was still the case. But he is now doing something far more important, which is helping the very charismatic and influential Mayor of London, which maybe you might reflect on that as well, mate.
Very good, thank you. Well, good evening. It's a great honour, great pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you very much to Jim for that very kind introduction. In fact, both he and I were in Birmingham earlier on this afternoon at the Tory Party conference. So I'll try not to talk about Europe that much in the next 25 minutes, having spent maybe 48 hours talking about Europe and nothing else. The title of my talk is The New Economic and Political World Order, Challenges and Opportunities. I think there's a danger in economics of what I call the status quo bias. Before the crisis, the consensus in economics, exemplified maybe by people like Larry Summers, was very upbeat and positive about the world economy, and then we had the crisis. Many of the same people who were very articulate, very smart people, and articulate and positive before the crisis are the same people who are very pessimistic now. At the same time, another aspect of the status quo bias is people are reluctant, I think, to embrace what's really happening across the globe. And the combination of both those factors, I think, makes people in the West unnecessarily pessimistic at the moment. At the same time, I think economists don't differentiate enough between relative and absolute. And I think that's going to be a key factor in the future, because I'm very positive about the world economy. I think the global economic cake is going to get considerably bigger over the next 2 to 3 decades. I think the slice of the cake that goes to the West will be smaller, but there will be a lot more cake. So in absolute terms, Europe, to less so the UK, will see their role shrink. But in relative terms, we'll see our role shrink. But in absolute terms, we'll still be doing pretty well. I think in recent years, we've seen that status quo bias lead to pessimism. But at the same time, there is still considerable uncertainty at the moment. In economic terms, Europe faces a debt deflation problem. And Europe, the Eurozone in particular, is likely to underperform. China will slow down. And there's still an overhang of debt in many Western economies, including the States and the UK. In geopolitical terms, I'll touch on Russia and Ukraine. And of course, we have latest problems in Hong Kong. If you want to find reasons to be pessimistic and cautious, there are lots of reasons. But since the crisis 7 years ago, we've had a very divided world economy, the East outperforming the West, a very disconnected world economy, particularly exemplified by high rates of youth unemployment, where 1 in 8 young people globally is unemployed. And we've had an environment of major policy dilemmas. But that being said, I'm going to outline to you why I think we should be positive. Not too many people talk about the growth rate of the world economy, but anything below 3% tends to be weak. Anything above 4% is strong. Last year, the world economy hovered around 3%. This year, it may get up to 3.5%. That should give you a benchmark of where 3 to 3.5% is. Now, if the world economy grew on average by 3.5% over the next 20 years, and given what I've just said to you about where we are in terms of current growth rates, you could see maybe that 3.5% is not particularly outrageous in terms of being overly optimistic. 3.5% would see the world economy in real terms, after allowing for inflation, double in size in the next 20 years. And it would see average global incomes rise by 2/3 over the next 20 years. If the world economy actually had a bit of motor and picked up steam and grew by, on average, 4% per annum, you'd see average global incomes go up by 80% over the next 20 years. We should, I think, be positive. But in the West, people are cautious. And at the end of last year, the World Bank produced an analysis of global income distribution, which I think sort of, in some respects, hits the nail on the head as to why people in the West are slightly cautious. They looked at average global incomes from the fall of the Berlin Wall at the end of the 80s until the beginning of the financial crisis. I doubt if things have changed too much since. If you took then, back in the late 80s, the poorest person in the world is 0 on the global scale of 0 to 100, and the richest person as 100. Over that 20-year period until the financial crisis began, the biggest relative gainers were those who were at 40 on that global scale, the emerging middle class in China. The biggest relative, and it is the word relative losers, were those who were at 85 on that scale. They were richer than 85% of the world's population, but they were the relative losers, and they were the low-income earners in the West. So globalization has led to relative challenges. But when we look at the world economy in the future, as I say, I think the global cake will get bigger. But that doesn't mean I'm positive about all emerging economies or about China all the time. These economies will have cycles. Moreover, economies like China don't have the institutional setup that we take for granted here in the West. that means they will find it harder when they get hit by shocks, maybe. Certainly, it's difficult to run China from Beijing in the way it's probably been run in the past and to run it that way in the future. As a result, I think the trend for China and for many emerging economies, while it will still be up, could be more volatile. And I wouldn't be surprised if when China has a setback, as it will, you'll have lots of people in the West saying, I told you so. But in my view, the pessimists about China are like stopped clocks. At some stage, they will be right, but they are absolutely no use in helping you tell the time. Moreover, it's a case of how we in the West position ourselves. And in the book that Jim kindly mentioned, I talk about 4 key drivers of the world economy in the future. Economic and financial is one. Soft power is another. That's the power of brands and persuasion. And I think the West does very well on that. The changing policy institutions is another aspect. And hard power, military spending, and geopolitical influence is another key factor. So economic and financial power, soft power, hard power, and policy making. This evening I'd like to focus on 2 of those, just given the time, otherwise we would be here all night. I'd like to touch on the economic and financial shifts that should make us positive. And then I will focus on the geopolitical tensions that are likely to emerge. But let's take the economic and financial drivers. Look, many of the factors that we can talk about now are factors that we could have talked about at any time in the past, certainly in the last few decades. But timing is everything. And I think some of the key underlying drivers of the world economy really do matter more now than they have done in the last few decades. I call it perspiration, inspiration, and trade. Perspiration is more people. The global population is rising. 1 in 12 people in the world is an Indian under 27. Yet the fastest growing part of the world's population is older people, not that people over 65 are necessarily old anymore. The number of people over 65 is rising from currently 1 in 14 to about 1 in 6 in 20 to 25 years' time. China, South Korea, Japan, and parts of Western Europe in particular. So the population dynamics are changing, but one key factor is we are seeing more emerging middle-class consumers across the globe. Indeed, in India, from 1971 to 2003, it took 32 years for average incomes in India to go from $100 to $500. It then took only 5 years for those average incomes to go from $500 to $1,000. We've seen an even faster pace of growth in average incomes in China, and we've seen similar trends elsewhere. More people. Also, cities are becoming more powerful. And I know that Jim, heading up the Cities Commission in the UK, is addressing this issue from a UK perspective. But when you look at cities, it's interesting, according to McKinsey's, that over the next 20 years, 2/3 of global growth will come from the top 600 cities. What I find fascinating is that of that top 600, 157 are currently in the West. But in 20 years' time, only 20 will be in the West. According to McKinsey's, the 3 cities in 20 years' time that will have the highest number of young urban consumers will be Lagos, Dar es Salaam, and Dhaka. Hands up who wants to go and work in those cities now. You might be wanting to work there in the future. Here in the UK, we only have 1 city that currently is sitting in that top 600. That's London. London needs to compete globally. And as I keep saying, and Boris has said as well, what we need is more cities in the UK replicating London's success. So more people, urbanisation, and more consumers. Inspiration. Some of the most pessimistic economists in the world are in the States, it seems, at the moment. And I find it quite amazing, given how innovative America has been over the years, that one of the reasons they're so pessimistic is that there's a group of economists, very smart people, so we shouldn't underestimate what they're saying, but their view is that we've seen all the big inventions. They may be right, but I think it's completely wrong. I think we're already seeing evidence of a 5th industrial revolution. The first was a couple of 100 years ago here in Britain. The second was at the tail end of the 19th century in America, in Germany, and in Russia. The third in the 20th century, petrochemicals, plastics, the growth of mass consumerism. The fourth in the last 30 years with IT revolution, and now the fifth. But the fascinating thing is the fifth industrial revolution is across a whole swathe of areas. Genomics, in terms of medical advances. Some smart people in Northeast America claim that the first person to live to 150 is already alive. Maybe, but we're certainly seeing life expectancy continuing to increase. Artificial intelligence, robotics. Japan, because of its aging population, has spent more on robotics than many other countries, and already there's massive advances there. Nanotechnology, greater connectivity, even problems are leading to big changes. Waste, one of my friends is really excited about waste and keeps bombarding me with all the dramatic changes taking place in waste. You wouldn't believe it. Then on top of that, we have the green economy. Nick Stern in particular, and I sit on the institute with Nick at the LSE and Imperial, Nick talks about the fifth industrial revolution in just green area, the green economy. And on top of that, we've got 3D printing and other changes. There is, in my mind, phenomenal, inspirational change taking place. And then on top of that is trade, which I think should hold out a positive outcome for Britain and for London, given, as Jim has pointed out before, that London has been the centre of the BRICS, as well as being at the centre of Western trade. We're seeing the rise of what we would have called South-South trade, more trade between what used to be emerging economies, but you could call them pretty developed economies now. Trade of goods, of commodities, remittance flows, portfolio direct investment flows. China is at the center of much of this. China into Asia, China into Africa, China into Latin America. Moreover, I think we're already seeing the early stages, what I saw 10, 12 years ago in East Asia. Then, when you went to speak to policy makers in many countries in East Asia, they then saw China as a competitive threat. Over the years, they changed and started to see it as a market to sell into, a growth opportunity. I think we're now seeing the same in terms of attitudes towards India. India and South Asia, India into Southeast Asia, India into the Middle East, India into East Africa. So inspiration, perspiration, and trade. All of these factors, I think, should make us more positive about the global economy. There are challenges. There are not only near-term challenges, there are some longer-term challenges. Antibiotic-resistant drugs. Fuel becoming a bigger challenge. Maybe we're beyond not peak fuel, but maybe we're on peak cheap fuel. Water. But what I've seen over the years is that when we've identified problems, we've often eventually found solutions to them. So problems should never be underestimated. We can't be complacent about them. But at the same time, sometimes they actually provide another reason to sometimes be positive. But the key thing is to recognize there are challenges, but at the same time identify what I consider to be some of the longer-term positive trends. That's the economic and financial shift. But let me also talk about what I call hard power, which is geopolitics. Because at the moment, many people, well, not many people, some people say to me, this is the reason to be really cautious. Last week, I had the pleasure of listening to Gary Kasparov speak, and he's written a very interesting book, but he was so pessimistic about Russia and its influence. I disagreed with him. But I hear some similar people express concerns about China's influence in Asia. Let me address those. I actually think hard power, military spending, has been and is one of the key global drivers, but we don't always see it like that. But when you look at the spending data in terms of military expenditure, it's fascinating. 15 countries in the world account for 83% of global military spending. America is in number one place and spends as much as the next 10 put together. In fact, during the Cold War, we saw Russia and America gain the advantage in scientific excellence. It funded both countries' space exploration. America, obviously Russia in some respects has fallen by the wayside, certainly on that area, but the US has remained and retained its cutting edge in much technical areas. It's at the forefront of scientific development and technical innovation. And many US universities have benefited from America's military expenditure. It's actually in some areas been a force for good. But when we look at the future, I think President Obama's two most important words were the words and the words pivot. And the word and, in the context I'm going to use it, was used in his first week. And I personally think it was the most important thing he did as US president. When he came to power, America had a strategic economic dialogue with China. They met each year, and it sometimes worked. Often it didn't always work, their annual meetings. He changed it to a strategic and economic dialogue. And the and, I think, was very important. It meant subsequently, and in the last 6 years we've seen this, that the US relationship with China went on one level on economic and another level on strategic. And on the economic side, I think this is probably the most important economic development of our time. Russia and America were involved in the Cold War. China and America are going to compete. And I'll come on to the strategic aspect in a minute. But in economic terms, they've become intertwined, like a cat's cradle. It's not just China holding US treasuries. It's not just American companies selling into the Chinese market. I would actually say it's ensured that China has embraced American capitalism, maybe with Chinese characteristics, who knows. But basically, the free market system and capitalism, I think, has become embraced across Asia. It's resulted, in my view, in economic terms, a pro-US bias in economic thinking across Asia, including ASEAN as well as Northeast Asia. And I would say that in Asia, people speak American in business. And I think that and word is very vitally important. But the strategic side is a lot more complex, and we shouldn't kid ourselves about the challenges there. In the last big meeting between the Americans and the Chinese, it was cybersecurity. But more than that, it's about China's future relationship with its Asian countries in terms of the South and East China Seas. Now, China's military spending in nominal terms has gone up on average by 14.9% from 2001 to 2011. Sounds big, but when you actually look at it in relation to its economy, China's real military spending hasn't changed too much. It's about 2% or so of Chinese GDP. That being said, China has concerns. In particular, the Malacca Strait near Singapore is the Gibraltar of the East in terms of, well, Singapore was the Gibraltar of the East. Gibraltar, as you know, well, you know where Gibraltar is, but Gibraltar in the Mediterranean was strategically important because it controlled trade in and out of the Mediterranean. Before the Second World War, Britain used to call Singapore the Gibraltar of the East because of its important strategic location before we obviously lost it to the Japanese and before it eventually became independent. But Singapore is in a strategically important position because of the Malacca Strait. In fact, there are 4 key choke points in the world economy in terms of key areas that are vitally important to keeping global trade flowing. The Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Straits of Hormuz, and the Malacca Strait. China relies on the Malacca Strait for a high amount of its energy. So China often, or in China, people have talked about the Malacca dilemma. On top of that, there is their claims to a various host of different islands, the Spratly Islands, the Paracels, even the Scarborough Shoal. What does it mean? Well, not only did President Obama talk about the word and, his other key word is pivot. President Obama has talked about the pivot of America with Asia. America, for domestic economic reasons, doesn't want to increase its defense spending. But what we're seeing is America increasing its influence indirectly through Japan and through India. I would actually go as far as to say that Japan could possibly be seen the equivalent of a new Korean War in terms of the impact on its economy. In the sense, not that it's going to war, but when the Korean War took place, that had a big positive impact on the Japanese economy. And I see evidence of that now. But the other big change is in India. There's something called the Australian Defence White Paper. Very sad thing to say I've read it, but it was really interesting. Last year, they talked about Asia-Pacific being the terminology of the past and Indo-Pacific being the terminology of the future. The importance of India in the Pacific region. In fact, you could argue India, maybe even Australia, but certainly Japan and America, and that whole relationship in geopolitical terms becomes very important. How does China respond? It remains to be seen. But at the same time as this is happening, the Chinese, in my mind, are developing their own strands, not only their claims on islands in the South and the East China Seas, but the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement has suddenly become vitally important because China looks at the Malacca dilemma and then it looks at the need to get energy across land from the Middle East. The Middle East, I remember after the financial crisis, going regularly to the Middle East and people talking about how in previous shocks, in previous crises, when America and Europe were hit hard, the Middle East would suddenly go into recession. Not this time. Like a Roman god Janus, to show that I do pay attention to Boris Johnson, I now take notice of Greek and Latin. But Janus looked both ways, and the Middle Eastern countries are looking both ways, east as well as west. So China is developing greater ties with the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. But also its relationship with Russia, I think, is an interesting one to watch. Earlier this summer, I had the honor and pleasure of meeting Mr. Kissinger, albeit only for a short while. But then he spoke at an event, and he said something really, he was speaking on the record, so I'm not giving any secrets away. He said something profoundly interesting in my view. He said in his mind, for the last 40 odd years, I can't remember the exact time period, but I guess it was 40 years because he was going back to the early 70s. He said he thought that America's policy towards China and Russia had always been to be closer to Russia and closer to China than they were to each other. And he said America had always succeeded in that. But he said that was no longer the case. He felt that China and Russia were no closer to each other than individually either of them were to America. And I did ask a senior Chinese person I know whether that's the case, and he said yes. I think he quoted that China used to have 12, whatever it was, battalions, divisions, whatever it is, on the border with Russia, and it was now down to 1. Whether that's actually the case, but I think the trend has moved. And when one looks at global military spending, America spends 39% of global military spending. Russia is 5.2%. China is 9.5%. So it's America 39, China 9.5%, Russia 5.2%, Britain in 4th place at 3.5%, and Japan in 5th place at 3.4%. What, therefore, given the time, let's talk about the future and how things pan out. What does this mean? In terms of the economic future, I would say that the countries that do well will be those that have at least one of the 3 C's: the cash, the commodities, or the creativity. The UK, thankfully, has cash in terms of financial resources. Given Scotland didn't vote for independence, it still has some commodities. But far more importantly, we have creativity in bounds. Indeed, earlier this year, Deloitte did a very interesting analysis. And the trouble about the figures is that you're never sure whether they're 100% accurate, but I think they give her a flavour of things. They talked about which cities had the highest number of high-income, knowledge-based jobs globally. In 5th place was Boston at 425,000. In 4th place was Hong Kong at 630,000. In 3rd place was Los Angeles at 784,000. 2nd place, New York at 1.2 million. And in 1st place, London, 1.5 million. So in terms of creativity, we seem already to have a lot of creativity here in the UK, but we need to actually recognise the need to keep it. At the same time, the countries that do well and the companies that do well need to be those that adapt and change, those that play to their strengths, those that adopt best practice, and those that are global in their outlook. And I think for Britain, we need to be positive. Over the next 30 years, Britain's population will overtake the population of Germany. Germany's population is in the low 80 millions. Ours is currently 63.5 million. If we just make small gains in productivity, and I think we will easily do that given where our centres of excellence are, then I believe that Britain will become the biggest economy in Western Europe. In my view, we should actually push more aggressively our stand on the European Union. I believe the best outcome for Britain is to be in a reformed European Union. But if Europe does not reform, then I do believe we should leave, and I do believe that we would do well if we did leave. However, as I say, and Boris's view is very much the case that we should try and reform Europe. But I think the key thing is that we are thinking globally and we are trying to position ourselves globally. We are also positioning ourselves well with respect to China in areas such as the RMB, the offshore Chinese currency, the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. The Prime Minister on his trip to China last November had a half-day session on the Shanghai Free Trade Zone to help China move to its next stage of development. The thinking being that Germany, which is seen in China, in my view, as the political and the economic capital of Europe, Germany currently is benefiting from the global infrastructure boom and China's manufacturing boom. But in the future, as business and financial services develop, Britain should benefit from the next stage of Chinese reform. How we play the politics remains to be seen, and Hong Kong, therefore, comes very much to the fore. Hong Kong is interesting. As a number of people have written from the Hong Kong authorities, Carrie Lam in particular, who used to run the Hong Kong office here in London, it was the basic law of Hong Kong in 1990, not the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984, that led to the agreement of universal suffrage and the election of the chief executive of Hong Kong. She talks of a 4 to 5 point plan in terms of how Hong Kong needs to embrace democracy. The challenge, of course, will be how China handles it. But I think it's important for Britain maybe to recognise that while I think we should stand up when China criticises us on the Dalai Lama, maybe this is an area we maybe should best observe passively. Indeed, the Chinese have always talked about the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955, where it had a 10-point plan, but point 4 was abstention from intervention or interference in the internal affairs of another country. But I think what it shows for me is that when you look at institutional setups, China is in an evolutionary process. And I think we have to observe how they handle this as well as other aspects domestically. But the key point really for me is that when we look at our relationship with China, I think in economic and financial terms, it maybe will become like that cat's cradle relationship China currently has with America in economic terms as well. So to conclude, I think the world economy is going to be driven by 4 key factors in the future. Economic and financial power, which I've touched on. Soft power, which I haven't gone into, but it's the power of brands, where I think Britain and the West will do well. Policy institutions, which I haven't gone into, but it's about the need for things like the IMF and the World Bank to change. And geopolitics or hard power, where there will be tensions. But I think my view is we should be positive. China naturally will play a much bigger role in the future, and hopefully Britain, London, and of course Manchester will as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Gerard, for that remarkable tour de force of the world. And I'm very relieved you said that about Manchester. You know, listening to you, it is not surprising to me as to how much you and I think similarly about many of these issues, even though we haven't spoke about any of them for God knows how long. And As you're thinking of questions, I won't talk for too long because, as I said, we plan to finish at 7:30, and Stephen, you're going to make some closing remarks, I think. So I want to make sure you guys all have some time. But I'd just make really 3 observations and actually start off with a question to you on the back of it. First of all, as you covered so eloquently at the start, it still really surprises me that the professional economic or the international economic forecasting community actually doesn't seem to realize how strong the world has been. Many people, even within that community, don't know that in the last decade, despite 2 pretty horrendous crises, world GDP growth was stronger than the previous 2. And in my opinion, if Europe could ever, continental Europe could ever sort itself out, there would be a pretty good chance that world GDP growth would be the 4% that you've said. In fact, that's the potential growth rate I am assuming for the next 20 years. So we have very similar thoughts on that. The second interesting thing for me to reflect on more is this very complex thing involving hard power. And I think that the reference you made to Henry Kissinger, who by the way is a Liverpool fan, so shouldn't be listened to about everything, is very interesting about China and Russia. And as I've opined personally to a number of people in this country, that if we really want to start getting people on board about the fact we don't like what Russia's doing, we probably need to spend a bit more time talking to Beijing than we do to plenty others because of the kind of things that you touched on. And then the third thing, which was so nice to hear you finish on for us in the UK, I have found myself thinking more and more, including the 18 months since I left my lengthy time at Goldman Sachs, that we have moved quite quickly into what I call a new era of China, which is all about the quality of growth rather than the quantity. And in my judgment, the winners and losers of the new China are completely different than the old winners. And I personally believe that the UK is extremely well positioned to be one of the biggest winners of the new China. And this leads me to the question, I'll stop for now. It's slightly surprising to me that there wasn't a lot more media attention here on the UK in the announcements that followed the latest economic dialogue meeting between the two, and in particular the agreement for the UK Treasury to issue an RMB denominated bond. Very important development in my opinion, and amongst other things indicative of the fact that, famous last words, but I think our government has probably got it about right on the Hong Kong issue, because I can't imagine that their counterparts would have agreed to that if they thought otherwise. And I'd be interested to hear your reflection on that. But my question is, so there's my 3 observations and loads of other things I could say. But here's my question to start people off. I think you said, when you were teasing the never-ending doubters about China, you said when it has a setback. Would you not describe some things that have happened to China in the past 2 years as a setback?
Yeah.
Or is that just all part of the normal adjustments going on?
Okay. I think it's already part of the setback. Actually, in the book I described, and I'm sure I've said it once before in the 48 group event, so I was hesitant to use it again. I've described China as Goldilocks, Robin Hood, Goldilocks and Superman economy. And I won't go into it, but the Goldilocks I think is very relevant. The porridge in Goldilocks was not too hot. And I think the Chinese have been great at keeping the temperature of their economy at the right level. Too hot, inflation picks up, food price inflation hits the poor, they riot. Chinese don't like it, or the Beijing doesn't like it. Too cold, economy is weak, unemployment picks up. As we saw after the financial crisis, migrant unemployment picked up. They don't like it. So they've managed to do remarkably well. I think what we've seen in the last few years is they're managing the cooling of the economy in terms of from that higher temperature to a softer temperature. But the challenge in the last few years has also been the whole financial sector and the shadow financial sector maybe, and the fact that I think the way I would say it is I think there are three types of infrastructure: hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, institutional infrastructure. China does really well on the hard infrastructure, Britain not so good. Soft infrastructure, skills, education, China is probably pretty much like Britain. It's the institutional infrastructure that I think China probably needs to develop further. But yeah, I would say the real shock would be if they go sub 5% growth and stuff like that. So I think they've handled things relatively well in recent years.
I agree with that. Okay, so it's your time. Can I just, I'm going to try and manage this in the way I tend to do these things. So before anybody starts, can I please implore you not to make big, lengthy statements of your philosophies of life, but to ask questions, and I'll try taking a few so we can perhaps address, because I'm sure there'll be commonality. So there's roving mics here. Who wants to kick off? Oh, I hope I didn't scare everybody with that comment. There's a lady at the back there.
Hello.
You might want to say who you are.
Sorry, Miranda Carr from NSBO. You said that the US and Europe would be the biggest influence on soft power as we come in. But I was wondering what you think, how important the rise of China's soft power and how that will actually sort of change the things in the next sort of 5-10 years, because that could be the biggest sort of change that we see in China, as well as the economic growth.
Okay, hold on. There's somebody over here, I think, this gentleman.
Thanks. Andrew Robertson, Herbert Smith Freehill. So just was wondering a bit more, Gerard, on that Indo-Pacific connection. I didn't quite understand that, and where does China fit within that Indo-Pacific axis?
And there's a gentleman here in the middle. Here.
John Hughes from BP. Let me move from the Pacific to Africa. You mentioned, Gerard, 3 main population centres. What does that mean for China in Africa? We work with Chinese companies in Africa a lot. How will it change? What will it mean for the world and for Africa?
So why don't we take that? I'll just jokingly say in regard to that, I was laughing when you said it. I actually spent more time in Lagos than any other city outside the UK the past 18 months, which I don't know whether that means I'm sick or what, but or maybe I'm a leading indicator.
It means you should answer the question.
Anyhow, so there's 3 different questions.
In fact, the Radio 4 programme, when you were in, it was quite. Was it the cement mine you went to, or there was a guy who was becoming a mega rich guy in Nigeria? And it was cement, wasn't it? Cement or something?
The one and only Mr. Dangote, Africa's richest guy.
Yeah.
He is the dominant producer of cement in Africa.
Yeah. Interesting.
Very.
Probably will buy a UK football club in the future. Maybe Blackpool for Lord McNally in the second row. The 3 questions. First question from the lady was about soft power. What will China have? Well, I think there's a number of different aspects of soft power. And one aspect of soft power, I don't think China will be anywhere close at the moment. Another aspect, I think it is already emerging. One aspect of soft power is brands. And we're already seeing Chinese brands. But the other aspect of soft power is, soft power is a term Professor Nye developed. And when he was testifying to the House of Lords, to David Howe's committee last year or earlier this year, he described soft power as he or she whose story wins in an information age. And people want to believe your story. And I don't think yet people want to necessarily believe that the Chinese story has been independent. And so I think in terms of soft power, the aspect of soft power from China that's emerging is the brands of Chinese goods. The soft power as an independent voice in the world, not yet. The question about Indo-Pacific, there used to be this thought that China was trying to encircle India. It was called the String of Pearls because China was helping Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and others develop their deep sea ports, etc. It's not clear to me that China was doing that for anything other than commercial reasons, but who knows? But the argument, the point about Indo-Pacific is that America's pivot towards Asia is about ensuring that America probably doesn't spend more money, but that American influence remains. And it's, in terms of military terms, it's the emergence of India as well as Japan in terms of military capability. I haven't followed all of Mr. Modi's trip to the States, but I thought it was very interesting that despite all the rhetoric at the time, as soon as President Obama invited Mr. Modi to visit the States, he accepted it. And I think that US-India relationship should be a positive one. Third question is about Africa. Yeah, China and Africa, it's been like a pendulum is how I would describe it. China, one extreme, it went really good a few years ago. Then there was this backlash against China, phrase China's raping our countries and stuff like that. The pendulum swung the other way. And then it swung back towards China. And I think China handled it very well. They invited all the African leaders who supported China over to Beijing. The African Development Bank even hosted one of its annual meetings in Beijing or Shanghai. The Chinese, at the end of one of those meetings, announced a pot of money for Africa that just so happened to exceed what the G7 had committed to Africa. So the Chinese, I think, have handled it very well. But of course, Africa is going to develop, and as countries grow, then they become more nationalistic, and they want to do things themselves. So the relationship with China to Africa, and also Russia to Africa, is interesting. But when one looks at Africa, the top 10 countries in Africa, I was looking at this, they were the same top 10 countries 50 years ago and 40 years ago. So Ghana revised up its GDP by 63% a few years ago. Nigeria did it by 89%. It made some people skeptical, but what you're actually seeing is different countries are now measuring the size of their economies better, and you're seeing that the economies are much bigger. So in answer to the question, what does it mean? Well, maybe it would mean that the relationship between China and Africa needs to become more than just commodities. And for the rest of the world, people aren't always happy about some of the countries that China deals with, shall we say. So it's Zimbabwe, etc. But overall, I think the Chinese relationship is still heavily inward investment into Africa, commodity driven. But it'd be good to get Jim's comments on that.
Well, I'm reflecting actually back on my extensive trips there, including for the Mint series. Some of you may not know, I produced a radio documentary for the BBC about the so-called Mint countries, and Nigeria. Well, they were all very interesting, but Nigeria in particular. But in the context of this, just as interesting a person to speak to as Mr. Dengozi was the then not yet to be ousted central bank governor,
Mr. Zanussi.
Mr. Zanussi has got to be one of the most thoughtful economic policymakers I have ever met. And on this question, he had a very controversial comment piece in the FT before I interviewed him, saying that our future depends on us and not China. And I think from an African perspective, that is right, because they have to make sure they don't suffer from the commodity curse, of which I would say, given the turn in the commodity cycle, there are signs one or two African countries have made that mistake. But that is at the crux of the issue for the Africans to figure out themselves.
That's right.
And it's not really right for China to influence them one way or the other. But I mean, typically, the lazier countries will ignore that. And they will be very happy to get all China's help through the access related to commodities. But the ones that sustain better for longer will think more carefully about that, in my judgment.
Be interesting to see how the regional growth goes in Africa.
Yeah.
And if they do follow through and trading with one another, and there's lots of positive comments being made.
I mean, the absence of trade until very recently between African countries, they could stop fighting each other and start trading with each other. That would be another way of not having to worry about the influence of China so much. Yeah. Other questions? Gentlemen, there's lots now. That encourages me to encourage you to be brief, given that it's 7:20.
I'll be very brief. Yeah.
Gentleman here, and there's a lady there, and then I'll take that guy there. So starting with this gentleman here.
Cyrus from CVF. My question is, in terms of the optimism about the future of the world economy, what would be the key industries that would be running that, driving that? The role of RMB in the next 20 years and RMB internationalization and the RMB convertibility. How would that play a part? And how would environment hinder
That's
the
3
growth?
questions. This lady over here.
I think we're all very thrilled about Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba's recent listing on New York Stock Exchange. And despite its failure on Hong Kong Stock Exchange before. Yeah, so my question is, well, basically I was always wondering, has Alibaba ever considered London Stock Exchange as an option? And so basically I'm just wondering how does London...
Where is Xavier when you need him?
Yeah, and basically...
In Birmingham. He was
Yeah, just want to compare London and New York for a Chinese company. Thank you.
And this gentleman over here.
Yeah, a similar question. You didn't mention tonight, and it's about challenging opportunities. I would see what I'd call a disk economy, and
What,
so
sorry?
The disk economy. So digital, internet, cyber, and social, or social and cyber. The disk economy. How do you see that as an impact? And as you talk about in 20 years' time, the GDP on the internet, if you like, and the impact of social and cyber in that as well.
Do you want to take those 3 and then we can see if we have a chance to come back around for the others?
First question, the key industries. Actually, in Birmingham, at a session yesterday, I was asked something similar. And I pointed out that one of the big growth sectors in London in the last few years has been the tech sector. All the politicians are claiming credit for it, but no one predicted it. In India, when I used to visit India, people used to talk about Bangalore and the IT sector, and politicians in Delhi would say, gosh, we never expected that sector to grow, hence we never regulated it, hence it grew. So I think we should expect all sorts of sectors, plus the ones I've mentioned earlier. The RMB, I do think in time we will move to multiple currencies, in a sense that I would expect more countries to manage their own currency against the basket of currencies with which they trade. But I think the dollar still is pretty preeminent for now. But it'd be good to get Jim's views on that. China, Alibaba, I think the concern we need to be is governance and also cycles. London could be at the top of a cycle, hopefully not. Alibaba could be at the top of a cycle, maybe, I don't know.
I cannot resist adding something to that.
Yeah.
These guys in New York, quality control, they let the Glazers issue equity. Singapore, Hong Kong, and London turned them down.
Yeah. I didn't talk about brands, but Manchester United, the team that...
I was thinking about that.
Used to be a global brand. An emerging global brand of the future will be Fulham. So bear that in mind. Disk, moving quickly on. I've no idea, but I think look, the whole side of technology, I think is just fascinating. And coming back to the question on Africa, what I find fascinating about somewhere like Africa is that technology has allowed Africa to almost leapfrog things. And 650 million mobile phone users. It's quite funny. Barclays... was it Barclays or one of the UK banks recently talking about having mobile technology and then saying, well, we've been using it in Africa for a number of years already. So I think different countries can benefit. Energy intensity is a big concern. The energy component, we don't always take on board enough the energy cost of many of these things. But I think disk, I'm not an expert on the thing you mentioned. Cyber, clearly the cyber security is a concern. But then you could say 10 years ago, there used to be this annual survey of biggest risks in the financial sector, and people would cite the payment system being corrupted. So what happened? People had to invest a lot more money to try and minimize the chance of that ever occurring. So often when you identify risk, it doesn't mean that we underestimate the risk, but it often means that you then have to spend a lot of money to potentially address it.
So why don't we just do one last go around, and I apologise in advance because I'm only going to, I'll take, the 4 hands are currently up, then no more. So 2 ladies over here, somebody at the back, actually that's now 5, and then we'll stop. 1 here, over here, and this lady. So starting over here.
Quick question.
If you could be brief, please.
It's a little bit about the shadow economy and the shadow banking system that you touched upon briefly, it's like, what is the risk on the global impact?
Okay. Next to you.
My name is Ning. I'm from Liu International. Thank you for Gerard and Jim give us lots of information here, very interesting. As we all in London, and I saw the property market in London increased dramatically. Some people are very happy, of course, we understand, and some people are not. I suppose there are more people are not happy. Since the first half of this year, the mortgage policy has changed, of course, and which left the bank has lots of money which can't let because the policy. Anything will be changing in the second half of the year.
His boss is on the front of tonight's Evening Standard about it all.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
Yep. Well, I heard him this morning.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I read
you
it
were there.
yesterday.
You wrote it.
No,
You wrote
I didn't
it.
write it. I didn't write it.
It's,
No,
it's
I
his
did
fault.
not write it. I do write it. Yeah. There would have been a reference to the photo.
Thank you very much. My name is Ing Su. I have a question regarding geography and growth in cities. You mentioned earlier that the success of London can be replicated across the country. I just wondered what your thoughts would be on, sort of, for example, replicating the success of Shanghai to other cities in China. What are the practicalities and rather obstacles facing those cities? Thank you.
And I think last one over here. Thank you.
Colin Lloyd. My question is about the geopolitical situation in the Middle East and elsewhere with Islam and so forth. You didn't mention that at all. I wonder if you see that as being a major factor in economic terms, anyway.
Okay, so just as an intro on the first one, when the night Gerard was launching his book at a review, I was at a competing event with the one and only Mr. George Soros, who I sat with, and he said at this dinner that he thought the biggest risk in the world was the Chinese shadow banking system, which I actually disagreed with him openly about it there, and we had a very interesting debate, but interested to hear your take on that and all the other things.
Yeah, the challenge in banking is that before the financial crisis, the banking sector, you could argue, wasn't regulated sufficiently. So like the pendulum, I used the analogy of pendulum earlier, certainly we've gone from light regulation and the pendulum has swung to the other extreme. And when you start to regulate something more, then people go to the shadows, the areas not regulated. But at the end of 2012, the size of the global shadow banking industry, excluding China, was $71.2 trillion. $26 trillion in America, $22 trillion in Europe, $9 trillion in the UK. So it's big. The thing is, when you look at it, some of the things that are in the shadow banking industry are good things. It's about supply chains working better. So not all aspects of the shadow banking are bad. The challenge about it is because it's shadow, it means that policymakers aren't able to assess where the risks are. And that means it's a greater cause for concern. It should make us maybe more cautious when you see big shifts in policy on interest rates and stuff like that. Maybe it would cause policymakers to move more gradually. But so it'd be interesting to get your thoughts about China. You see, again, people always... China is at such a different stage of development, certainly in its financial sector. People are always nervous about anything. But when you look at it in the scale...
when I hear somebody like George say that, who's probably made more money in the hedge fund business than all other hedge funds put together, I don't ignore it. And actually, somebody who I frequently debate China with, Jim Chanos, basically has the same view. But I think I agree with what you said. The reason why there is such a big shadow banking system because it hasn't been allowed to, the banking system hasn't been allowed to develop as fast as the real economy. So by definition, if you control it, it kind of goes the other way. So the fact that it's so big per se is, in my judgment, neither here nor there. So long as the policymakers are focused on the risks that can come from it, which, in my opinion, distinguishes China from so many other countries, I tend to worry about it less, but I worry that people smarter than me worry about it more than I do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Second question, London house prices. Gosh, haven't been asked about this for at least 6 hours. The solution to London house prices is supply, 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 supply. And the Mayor of London is doing a great job. In fact, London this year will have more private sector houses built than any year since 1982. Good. And if he wasn't running for another office in Westminster, I think he should be re-elected as mayor in a couple of years' time because he's doing such a great job. But the challenge in central London is local supply and global demand. Global demand, local supply, that means prices go up. But maybe it might prove to be more volatile in the future. Cities, it'd be great to get Jim's view on this. I'm very excited about your cities report that's coming out. It's about the 15 cities outside London. And that comes out later.
22nd of October.
Yeah. Because I do think it's not a case. I find this whole thing in the UK, north-south divide, I just get fed up hearing about it. Basically, London has 19% of people in London earn less than the living wage. Phenomenal number of people are earning more than the living wage now. 5 of the poorest boroughs in the country are in London. So all the issues in that so-called north-south divide you see encapsulated in London. But London is 22.5% of the UK economy. There is a big regional impact. 3 of the 5 most competitive regions in Europe, according to the European Commission, are in the south of England. One's London, the other's Surrey, Sussex, another Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire, Oxfordshire. So there is a positive impact from London. But what we really need to do is replicate that across the rest of the country. David Smith in the Sunday Times calls it the 3 I's: investment, innovation, and infrastructure, which I quite catchy. But you asked about Shanghai. I would imagine it's pretty much the same thing. But the Shanghai Free Trade Zone is really quite exciting. The Brits seem to be more excited about it than the Chinese at the end of last year, though. That was the funny thing. But 20 countries at the MPC, 20 cities, I think, at the MPC this March asked to have their own version of the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. So it's managing the pace of success. Look, geopolitics, Islam, gosh, I'm not even going to go there. But Theresa May gave a very good speech this morning. I was listening to it. But it's a very difficult issue, and I wouldn't want to comment on it. But what is interesting is, despite all those problems, normally you would see a risk premium pushing up the price of oil, but we haven't really seen that on this occasion. But
just very briefly, one of the things I'm doing at the moment is chairing an independent commission about cities in Britain outside of London, and it's been a very enjoyable, more enjoyable task than I realised, not least because the Chancellor has basically embraced many of the things that we have been talking about. And at the core of it, I think it's, and I'll sort of tangentially relate it to Shanghai, it's about people being more ambitious. We've gone around the country holding hearings, and in my own hometown of Manchester, I took some risk by quizzing some of those leaders as to what do they think of the concept of manpool. And those of you that know our country well, there is a lot of very complex history between Manchester and Liverpool, which does not just include football, although that is very much at the core of it. And I was nearly escorted out of the room. But after pointing out that you can manage to hate football teams in your own city, which you would do with Chelsea right down the road, to really make a difference, that's the sort of way people have got to think. And I really applaud the Chancellor's call for a Northern powerhouse, because it's the same spirit. And that's what, to really make a difference, to stop London's dominance of the country. It's not to do things to harm London, it's for other places to be bolder and seek more ambition. As this relates to China, I would just give the following observation. I've been going to China for, what is it now, far too long. The last couple of times I've been in Shanghai, and it's been less frequent than it used to be, I start to see signs of something that's almost of a level of development that I would think more of Japan, to be quite honest. It's parts of Shanghai are very sophisticated. So I think there is a lot for other Chinese cities to learn from how they have managed that process. Obviously, it's got its own environmental and pollution challenges, which the days when certainly I used to go to Tokyo 30 odd years ago, people used to say that about Tokyo. They don't have them anymore. So you can get out of these kind of things, and I think Shanghai in so many ways is the leading example of probably where much of urban China is going to go.
I agree. Very good.
So with that, let me turn it over to Stephen Perry, who's going to make some closing remarks on behalf of the 48 Group. Thank you very much.
Seeing this here reminds me of President Obama. Doesn't he say a word that way and that way? And I realise he's reading his speech. There's nothing there. Can I, first of all, before I turn to you, can I say this is our third event in 18 days. 18 days ago, we threw a dinner for Vice Premier Mackay, 400 people. Last Thursday, we had 300 people listening to Peter Nolan talking about the Silk Road. And tonight, we've had this fascinating conversation with Gerard, chaired by Jim. And I'd like to thank Stuart and Anthony and all their staffs and all the people in the 48 Group who enabled us, with virtually no staff, to put on these three events. Thank you all very much indeed who helped us to do this. Tonight is a fascinating opportunity, and I will leave it having had the opportunity to use all of you to get these two here so that I could learn from them. It's a wonderful opportunity. They're both two of the finest minds that I know, and I don't say that because they're sitting here and doing what they're doing tonight. I love listening to the two of them talk freely about subjects which most people are much more careful about every single sentence that they make on the subject. They talk with confidence and they talk with eloquence, but most importantly, they talk with experience. In closing, I would like to make two passing comments. One is to capture the image of the high-speed train going from Beijing to Berlin, to capture the image of the high-speed train going from North to South Africa, from the Pacific to the Atlantic coast of South America. These are the scale of ideas that China is thinking in terms of. The transformation in the Chinese economy over the next 5 years will be breathtaking. And Gerard captured all of that in his opening comment about should we be worried about the scale of Chinese thinking and the scale of Chinese development when he said the pie will grow much bigger. And maybe we in the West will have a smaller share than we have in the past, but we will all be able to benefit enormously from this transformation of the world economy. And Gerard reflected the concept of us all gaining and benefiting from the opportunities out ahead rather than being paralyzed by fear and anxiety. So perhaps to do with that, Gerard, I developed a thought over the last few weeks, a phrase taken from Deng Xiaoping talking about Hong Kong, one country, two systems. And I wondered whether, as you explored that, Gerard, a thought was in my mind, has been over the last few weeks, Keith and I have been talking about it, one world, two systems. And are we beginning to see the emergence of two systems which can coexist to produce something much better for us all? Let's hope so. Most of all, I hope that we can get you two back together in a year's time, because it just happens, as I close, that Fulham, I think, are in the Championship. Manchester United, I think, are not in Europe. The only team that I can think of that... Oh, I shouldn't go on. Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.